and welcome back to Mr. Austin and Cooper and Friends. We've missed you. It's been a while, and today we are talking with Rich Little. Rich is the author of Bottom of the Ninth. It's a novel. Ones and Twos, the history of first and second NFL draft picks. His book, Cold Case to Case Closed, Lizbeth Borden, My Story, has been featured on BuzzFeed Unsolved and is a bestseller at the infamous Lizzie Borden house in Fall River, Massachusetts. Rich is also a Rockland High School graduate, a former math teacher at Brockton High, and a professor at Bridgewater State University and Massasoit Community College. Welcome to the show, Rich.
Oh, Ryan, it's good to be here. This is social distancing at its best.
It certainly is. It certainly is. It doesn't get much better than this.
No.
So we had a couple questions for you about the Lizzie Borden murders. Obviously steeped in Massachusetts history, and we are doing a Massachusetts research project. So we're doing interesting facts about Massachusetts, or companies that are from Massachusetts, like Fluff, or maybe the cranberry industry. So we're doing a lot of kind of research projects about Massachusetts, and this seems to be a really popular and very interesting case. So our first question is, why Lizzie Borden? What made you interested in this subject, and what do you think draws people to this case so many years later?
That's a good question, Ryan. I initially knew nothing about the Lizzie Borden case other than it happened, and that little poem that everybody recites, that jump rope rhyming poem about Lizzie Borden and how many whacks she gave her mother and how many her father, etc. Which, by the way, the facts in that little poem are totally wrong. But my daughter always had an interest in it, and probably 15 years ago, for my birthday, she took me down to tour the Lizzie Borden crime scene at 92 2nd Street in Fall River, and that got me interested in it. And in 2011, I started working on a project with a co-author from Canada, and her name is Bev, and she and I started putting together cases, and the name of the book was going to be The Injustice of It All. And so we took cases. She being in Canada, there were a few Canadian cases, and me being here, there were some cases across Massachusetts, which became the crimes of that particular era. And one of the stories that we investigated was the Lizzie Borden story, and I assumed she was guilty from the very beginning. And as we both investigated it, she took the role of Lizzie Borden in the book, and comments throughout the book. I wanted to get a woman's perspective on what a woman would think about the proceedings, about the court proceedings, about being locked up, about being held for 10 months before trial. And so throughout the book, she interjects her perspective as a woman. And that's how I got started on the book, with my daughter giving me initial interest, and then it became a chapter in the book, The Injustice of It All. And since that time, Bev and I wrote the Lizzie Borden Cold Case to Case Closed, and I recently just finished another one that was in that Injustice of It All, and it was on the Billingham trial in Plymouth, the first person who was tried and convicted of murder in the New World in 1630, and that book has just come out in the last two weeks on Amazon, and it's basically about William Bradford and Governor William Bradford and how he became kind of like a tyrant. But I wrote that one myself and Bev, and when I say Bev, it's Beverly Folstad. She is the co-author of Cold Case to Case Closed. So that's how we got started on that particular case.
Well, that's when it started with one book, and I've often said in class too, one word or one sentence or one book can change everything, and it seems in this case maybe that has happened. So that's really good. That's a really good kind of reference for us as readers for my English class. So our next question is: now you're looking into a crime that happened almost 130 years ago. What were some of the challenges or difficulties of researching such an old case? I imagine wasn't just doing research on the internet.
No, other than I was able to go down there and tour the facility again, and I had access to two important things that led me to write the book in the with the idea that I don't think that Lizzie Borden was responsible for the murder. She may have known who, she may have known before, but I don't think she's the one that committed the crime. And what I base my conclusions on are two things. One was an article that was in the Fall River Herald on August 5th. That was the day after the double homicide, and that was on a Friday. And also, I was able to look at the police reports, which at that time were handwritten, but have since been transcribed. So they are now in typed form, so you can read them. And I read the report of one particular police officer, and his name was William Medley, Medley. And with his report, and then the report of the unknown reporter for the Fall River Herald, they kind of pointed to somebody else. And that person was questioned, and he soon became a witness for the prosecution. And after that, he wasn't asked many difficult questions.
Wow, interesting. So yeah, my next question was, and I guess kind of answered it there, was what was the police work or the criminal justice system like in 1892, the year the murders took place?
Well, things are different now as far as crime scene preservation and evidence gathering. Back then, let me give you a time frame. This murder happened during the day. There were two people that were slain. They could determine that they were not slain at the same time. There was probably an hour and a half to 2 hours between the deaths of Mrs. Borden, that would have been Lizzie Borden's stepmother, and then later at around 11 o'clock, the murder of her father, Andrew Borden. So they were not killed at the same time. There was at least an hour and a half difference between the two deaths, and that's really an important fact, that they were actually two separate crimes, similar in how they were murdered, with some type of blunt force object, which in both cases hit them in the front of the head. And in the case of Mr. Borden, the front and the top of the head. In the case of Mrs. Borden, she was first struck in the front, and then the other times that she was struck was in the back of her head. She evidently fell and rolled, and when she did, the assassin, proceeded to use some type of which was described as a hatchet, but I don't think it was a hatchet. I think it was something more like a heavy meat cleaver, which is kind of similar to a hatchet, but a little bit different in shape. but there was a time difference in between them, and back then they did not preserve the crime scene like they would today. People came in and out of the house. Newspaper reporters came in and out of the house. Was shown the two deceased.
Wow.
They had a gentleman come by and he said, "I used to live here 20 years ago. This is my house. Come on in, take a look, see what you see."
Oh,
And
wow.
so they literally took strangers, not strangers, but people unrelated to the Bordens or to the crime, and brought them in just so they could view the carnage. And in fact, Lizzie and her sister, who was away and returned that evening, Lizzie and her sister and a friend stayed at the residence, 92 2nd Street, that evening. And the two victims, the initial autopsies were done at the Borden home.
Wow.
If you read some reports, it was on the dining room table, but that's not true. They were done on what they call undertaker's tables, but they did the initial autopsy right at the scene on the afternoon. And you see some gruesome pictures of Mr. Borden and Mrs. Borden, and they believe this was the second time that photographic evidence was taken at a crime scene, and it was actually used in the court case when Lizzie was tried the following June in 1893.
So even though there's some
So can you guess?
So even though there's some relatively new techniques taking place at the time, it's still a far cry from the work we have today, or the
Right.
tools we have today.
There were not fingerprints back then. There was not other types of investigative evidence collecting. And can you guess what the first crime scene where they used photographic evidence?
No, I'm not sure. Really sure, actually.
Well, I thought maybe it might have been the Lincoln assassination.
Right. I remember one of the first X-rays was attempted to use then. So.
Right. But it wasn't. It was actually the Jack the Ripper case.
Oh.
In England, which was about a year before the Borden what was called at that time in the United States the crime of the century.
Wow. Even though she was found not guilty by a jury of her peers, why do so many people believe that Lizzie, or Lizbeth in this case, was the murderer?
Let me set the scene for you. Somewhere at 6 o'clock in the morning, Maggie Sullivan, who was the domestic servant, not necessarily a maid, but a domestic servant, she prepared the meals. She took care of the downstairs of the house. She started breakfast, and not too long after that, an overnight guest, an uncle by the name of John Morse, who had business dealings with Mr. Borden. He came down from the guest bedroom, and they both came downstairs about the same time. And you've got a picture that in this particular